Okay, good afternoon, and thank you very much, everybody, for coming to this lecture, coming to this talk. It's my first time in Torino, and it's very nice. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's a great pleasure to be here at the university and speak to you. I had two lectures over the last 2 days in Milano, and they were excellent. Many people came to listen and participate, and we had an excellent debate and conversation after the lecture. Because it's a very small country, it's not hard to miss. You know, it's a very small country, whether you call it Israel or Palestine, and I call it Palestine. But regardless of how you call it, it's very small. So usually the name is not on the country; the name is on Cyprus or Malta or something. So it's very, very easy to confuse. Now, before I start, I always like to give a small warning. My lecture is not a balanced lecture. And for people who like Israel, for people who feel that they're Zionists, for people who have some kind of positive feelings for Israel, my lecture is extremely difficult. In fact, it's difficult for people who oppose and reject Israel as well. Because the situation is very severe. The situation in Palestine is very severe. And I compare Palestine to a person who is bleeding to death, and the blood is going out very, very fast. Now, but I am optimistic, and you're going to see by the end of my talk that I actually have a great deal of hope, and I'm very optimistic about the future of Palestine. And the reason I'm optimistic is because the last 2 days, I spoke in Milano in front of hundreds of university students. And today we're here, and this room is completely full. And I go from country to country and from state to state in the United States, and I see halls like this full and full and full of people. And then, of course, if you add to that the social media aspect, where you have to give a lecture in front of 100 people, but then 100,000 people view it on social media, then, of course, you get a real realization of how many people actually care about this issue. And what this means to me is that all of these people, like yourselves here, who really, if you think about it, have no reason to be here, have no reason to care to hear about Palestine, but are realizing that Palestine is the moral issue of our day. Like the fight against apartheid in South Africa and other struggles that became international, each generation is defined by the struggle of their time. And all of us today are going to be defined by the issue of Palestine. And all of us who are lucky enough to participate in the struggle on the side of justice, we will be able to one day say with pride that we had a small role in this, in the freedom and justice that will soon come to Palestine. And you know, we know today that there were many politicians and many public figures and many individuals who, for example, used to call Nelson Mandela a terrorist and who were against the boycott against apartheid in South Africa and did everything they could to prevent the apartheid regime from falling. And today those people are embarrassed. Today those people are standing in the corner ashamed and hoping that we don't remember them. And the same goes for the issue of Palestine. I think we're going to see the same thing once Palestine is free. The people who stand in the way of justice and freedom in Palestine, the people who try to cancel events, the people who try to stand in the way of having free speech and a free debate on Palestine, and of course the people who are perpetuating the crimes of apartheid in Palestine, all of these people will be remembered, and I guarantee you they will either lie and say that they didn't do it, or they will hide somewhere in a corner and again hope that we don't remember. But of course we will remember. We will remember who they are. Now, when I speak about Zionism, when I speak about Israel, when I speak about the situation in Palestine, I didn't learn about this in a textbook, and I didn't learn about this in a university classroom. I grew up, and I was born and raised in Jerusalem, and I grew up in a family that was as Zionist and as patriotic Israeli as you could possibly be. I published a book a few years ago, and the title of the book is The General's Son. And precisely like the title of the book, my father was a general in the Israeli army. And he was a general in 1967, which was a very important time in the short history of Israel and Palestine. And his generation of generals, his generation of military commanders were and are still considered to be like the gods on the Olympus. They are the giants of Zionism, the giants of the legacy of the Israeli military. But that wasn't all of it. Within my close family, there's an ambassador, a president of the state, people who were members of cabinet, judges, people who were involved in the creation and then in the actual implementation of the State of Israel, the making of the State of Israel, then participated in the state itself. So as a child growing up, I would see in family gatherings, or the dinner table, weddings and things like that, all of these people around me all the time, and of course everybody talked about Zionism, and everybody talked about the state of Israel, all the time. That was the most important issue, and this was the most talked about topic all the time. And here I am today, traveling, here in Torino and all over everywhere else, speaking about Palestinian rights, speaking about the crimes of the State of Israel, and even more than that, rejecting Israel and rejecting Zionism completely. So how does that happen? How does it happen that somebody who grows up, who was raised in privilege, the privilege of the occupier, the privilege of the colonizer, the privilege of the oppressor, privileged in every possible way, suddenly grow a conscience? It doesn't happen very often, and it's not it's not a miracle. Usually it happens as a result of something terrible. Usually what forces us to change our perspective, what forces us to take a good look at what we know to be true, and then review it, and then change, has to do with something that is so shocking that it really shakes us completely and forces us to do this. Most of us don't do this willingly. Most of us don't do this unless we absolutely are pushed into it. So in my case, it was September of 1997. My sister's little girl was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem by Palestinians. And that is such a horrible experience that it's impossible to put it in words. But it's exactly the kind of experience, the kind of shock that I was talking about, that forces us into a place where we have to start to look at the world in a different way. How can we possibly understand, how can we possibly explain 3 young people, maybe about your age, decide to blow themselves up, kill themselves, and then kill a whole bunch of other people who are also maybe about the same age or younger, in the middle of the street, in the middle of the day? How can we possibly understand? And I don't think we can understand something that is so horrible. But I think we are obliged to try to understand. We're obliged to take a good look at what took place and learn more about it. Maybe we can't completely understand it, but we have to, when we're faced with a situation like this, try to wrap our head around it somehow and make sense of it. And I grew up in Jerusalem, so of course I knew there was a conflict, I knew there was a problem, I knew there were Palestinians who were committing acts of terrorism and so on. I wasn't completely ignorant. And what I decided to do is to embark on what I call a journey. And the journey, and that's also the subtitle of my book, that journey I call a journey of an Israeli in Palestine. So that forces us, or at least it forced me to understand what is an Israeli and what is Palestine. Where is Israel and where is Palestine? Is it the same place? And Israeli, to be Israeli and to be Jewish is not the same thing. To be Israeli means you are Jewish, but you were raised in that country. however we call it. To be Jewish, you could be Italian or American or Polish or Mexican, right? So these are things that I had to try to understand in order to understand what was taking place in this country that, of course, I called Israel, and eventually I learned that it was actually Palestine. And one of the things that I discovered, now, first of all, I have to say, the journey is very short because it's a small country. So the journey from where I lived, which, like I said, is an area of privilege. It's an area where the light is always on, and the electricity is always running, there's always water, the roads are beautifully paved, it's green and it's lovely. To the sphere, to the area of the other, to the area of the oppressed, the occupied, who in this case are the Palestinians, the journey is geographically very, very short. But it never occurred to me to take that journey when I was growing up in Jerusalem. And I don't know, I hardly know any Israelis that took the journey, or even today take this journey, because even though geographically it's a very short journey, politically, emotionally, mentally, it's an enormous step. And I realized just how effective the segregation was. I was raised in Jerusalem. You may have heard they call Jerusalem a mixed city, a united city. It's so segregated that you could live across the street from each other. In other words, Israelis here, Palestinians here, but there's no connection. And Israelis, as Israelis, we would never cross the street. We would never go into a Palestinian neighborhood. And why did we never take this journey? Well, because we know a few things about the Palestinians. And by the way, we never used to call them Palestinians, we just said Arabs, or the Arabs of Israel. And what we know about the Arabs is that they are dangerous, violent, uneducated, not as sophisticated as we are, unpredictable. And basically, for someone who looks like me, who comes from my very privileged sphere, to go into an Arab town, an Arab neighborhood, is a death sentence. It's a death wish. And what we see when we're in the country, whether people come to visit or whether you live there like myself, like I used to, what you see is that on the one side of the street where the Israelis live, first of all, it's modern, it's clean, it's nice, it's very European, very Western. On the other side, it's poor. There's a lot of poverty. It's not so clean. It's not very well developed. The streets are not as paved as nicely. There are all these problems. And the assumption is, and what we're told growing up, and what people assume when they come to visit, is again that on the Jewish side, the Israeli side, they're developed, they're European, they're white, they're sophisticated, they brought progress, and the Arabs are just backward. They are backward. They're a little bit dirtier, they're a little less developed, they're not as well educated. Obviously, why there's such high unemployment and poverty, they just don't know how to do things well, as opposed to the Israelis, the Jews who came to Palestine and made it bloom. So when I took the journey, here are a few things that I learned. For example, Palestinians are one of the most highly educated people on earth. So why are Palestinians in Palestine living in poverty? Well, they live in poverty because they do not have opportunities to work. That is why there is poverty and unemployment. Not because they don't have the means or the education, quite the opposite, but because Israel controls the economy. Israel controls who gets jobs and who doesn't, and Palestinians do not. So that was the first interesting thing that I learned. And then another thing that I learned that was extremely important is this: all of the water in the country, all of the water across the entire country, is controlled by the state of Israel through an agency, a special agency that is called Mekorot. And Mekorot controls the water, like I said, over the entire country, all of the water sources, and the distribution of water. Now, the country that I'm talking about, and I'm just going to call it Palestine because that's how I call it, it's from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, from the border of Lebanon all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba. That is the country. And the majority of the people who live in that country today are Palestinians. They are the majority of the population. The state of Israel, through the Israeli Water Authority, allocates 3% of the water to the Palestinian population. 3% to the Palestinian population. So what that means is that on the one side of the street you have people who live and they have all the water they want all the time. On the other side of the street you have people who know they're only going to get running water maybe 12 or 15 hours per week. So obviously if you have a family, your priorities are different. If you have you don't have to worry about water, then that's one thing. If you constantly have to worry about the supply of water, if you constantly have to worry whether or not you will have running water on a particular day, then obviously your priorities are entirely different. And it gets worse actually. You may have heard of this area called the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is an enormous open-air prison. It's a concentration camp that Israel created where 2.2 million people live and have no access to clean water. They have no access to proper nutrition, medical care, travel, or really any other rights. They live in a prison. And the lack of water in the Gaza Strip is one of the most severe humanitarian situations that we've ever seen. And again, I'll say it again, 2.2 million people living under Israeli control in a prison with no access to clean water. Then there's another area in Palestine called the Nakab Desert. The Nakab Desert is the southern half, almost half, of the country. And it's a desert, but it's a very fertile desert. It's a desert that's actually very good for agriculture. And there are about 200,000 Palestinian Bedouin living in the Nakab Desert. Now, about half of the people, half of the Palestinian Bedouins live in what Israel calls unrecognized towns. And the reason they're unrecognized is because they existed before the state of Israel was established, and the residents of these towns refused to be relocated. So as a form of punishment, they receive no access to electricity, no access to water, no roads, no access to medical care, and very, very little access to education. And these are citizens of the state of Israel. These Palestinians are actually citizens of the state of Israel, and this is the reality in which they live. And then the other half of the Bedouin Palestinians in the Nakab were moved and placed in townships. And when you look at these townships, then you see terrible unemployment, terrible poverty, and this population is naturally, it's indigenous to the Nakab Desert, and they are agriculture people, they are farmers. However, they are forbidden from engaging in agriculture, and the Israeli colonies, the Israeli settlements all over the Nakab Desert are flourishing, green and successful and wealthy and very beautiful, and right next to them, and sometimes it's really across the street, you see these centers of despair and hopelessness. And once again, these are citizens of the state of Israel, and these are citizens of the state of Israel. Yet there's an enormous difference between the rights and the possibilities and the opportunities that the Israeli Jews have and the Palestinians have, even as citizens of the state of Israel. Then there's another area that used to be called the West Bank. Maybe you've heard of the West Bank. The West Bank was an area that Israel created when it was established in 1948, and then originally it was left out of the state of Israel. After 20 years, Israel took it, conquered it, and made it part of the state of Israel. And today, the West Bank really no longer exists. It is an area of Israel that is called Judea and Samaria. And Judea and Samaria, just like any other part of the country, they have cities and towns, they have highways, they have shopping malls, they have schools. And one of the things that they talk about that exist within Judea and Samaria is what they call a problematic population. And this problematic population happens to be Palestinian. They live under a military rule, military law governs their lives. And those 3 million and the 2.2 million that live in the Gaza Strip are completely secluded, completely left out of anything that happens in terms of elections, in terms of democracy, in terms of the processes that affect their lives. And you may have heard that Israel has had elections every 6 months lately, and these 5 million people whose lives will be affected and are affected by the Israeli government, in other words, they are governed by the state of Israel, have absolutely no say in the results of these elections. They have no say as to who will be governing them and how they will be governed. So it's very interesting, because if you're an Israeli Jew like myself, you can live anywhere around the country and you have the same rights. It's really like living in a Western democracy if you're an Israeli Jew. Then you have Palestinians, some Palestinians who have some kind of an Israeli citizenship. It's kind of a quasi-citizenship. And then you've got Palestinians who live in a concentration camp in Gaza, and then you've got Palestinians who live in Judea and Samaria in these military little ghettos. Then you have Palestinians who live in Jerusalem and they have another status. And then you have Palestinians who were kicked out and have no right to return. And this is how Israel manages the reality in Palestine. And when people call it an apartheid regime, Israeli supporters in the state of Israel stand up and say, how can you say it's an apartheid regime? We're a perfect democracy. In fact, we're the only democracy in the Middle East. But of course, the very definition of apartheid is when you govern different people using different laws. So what is interesting is that the pro-Israeli groups and of course the official state of Israel, they're not offended by the fact that the apartheid exists. They're offended by the fact that we point out and we say, hey, this is an apartheid regime. So a very good book came out, I think it was about a year ago, in English. It's called Palestine, 4,000 Year History. And it was written by Noor Masalha. Noor Masalha is a Palestinian historian that teaches in London at SOAS. And if you, I don't know if it exists in Italian, but if you can read English well enough, I strongly recommend that you take a look at this book. And what's interesting about this book is that it might be the first time, I don't know, but even if it's not the first time, it's one of the few times that the history of this country is written based on history, not on the Bible, not on the Zionist narrative which relies on the Bible, but purely upon historical findings. And one of the things he shows very clearly, that this area that I defined earlier as Palestine has been called Palestine, has been referred to as Palestine by historians, ancient historians, as going all the way back to Herodotus, by the Greeks, by the Romans, by other empires, by the people who live within it, by writers, and so on and so forth, going back about almost 4,000 years. And what's interesting is that one day, in May of 1948, this country that was known as Palestine suddenly became Israel. And from that moment on, the entire world has been behaving as though it's always been Israel. As though Israel is this thing that's always been there, that is perfectly legitimate. And as people are, getting used to this idea, Palestine and the Palestinian people and Palestinian monuments and Palestinian names and Palestinian heritage is being destroyed day after day after day. So how did this happen? What was the process? How did this happen that suddenly Palestine became Israel? And if you remember a few minutes ago, I said that when we mention the word apartheid, then the Zionists are up in arms. How dare we say Palestine? Well, what I'm going to say next is going to make them jump even higher. Because if we take a look at the processes that have been taking place in Palestine over the last 7, 8 decades, we will see very clearly that these have been processes that have been defined as crimes against humanity. And I specifically mean genocide and ethnic cleansing. And on top of that, the apartheid regime that I described earlier. But you don't have to believe me. In fact, I don't want you to believe me. What I'd like you to do is check the definition of the crime of genocide. Check the definition of the crime of ethnic cleansing, and check the definition of the crime of apartheid. And if you look and compare to what has been happening in Palestine, you will see that it fits. You will see that genocide, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid, by definition, describe what Israel has been doing, what the Zionists have been doing in Palestine for decades and decades and decades. And once again, we hear the Zionists being offended by these words, instead of being offended by the actions. But I think it's incredibly important, if we are to understand the reality in Palestine, if we are to participate in the struggle for justice and freedom in Palestine, if we are to contribute to justice and freedom in Palestine, and if we are to somehow come up with a solution that would allow people in Palestine to live as normal human beings, to live in peace, we have to understand what is happening. We have to understand the processes that brought us to where we are today. And by the way, all of these three crimes did not start and stop. They started and they are ongoing. To this day, we see the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, and the apartheid regime continuing every single day. You know, if you want to kill someone, but you don't want to spend money on a bullet, if you deny them water, that's pretty sure. That's a pretty sure bet that you're going to be able to kill them. So the ways in which Israel kills Palestinians are very, very diverse. In other words, we know about the bombing in Gaza. We know about the shooting of innocent protesters in Gaza for months and months and months now, as Palestinians are protesting for their freedom. We know the Palestinians are being killed in the West Bank, they're being killed everywhere. But they're not only being killed by weapons, they're also being killed through the denial of water. Now, all of us here in this room, and in places or in rooms and countries and cities across the world, we are bound, morally bound, to participate in this struggle. We are morally bound to act. We are morally bound to see that Palestine will be free, that Palestinians will get their water, that refugees will return to their homes, that the siege on Gaza will end, that the political prisoners, thousands of them, will be released. We are all morally bound because we are all participants. We all are participants because we live in democracies and the governments that we elected are supporting this. So if we do nothing, we are complicit. If we want to stop being complicit, we must stand and we must act. I was asked the other day, actually I've asked this quite often recently, is there any way to deal with the Palestine issue, to support the Palestinian struggle, and not be labeled anti-Semitic? And the answer to that is no. Because the Zionists, with their PR machine, with their propaganda, with their very effective methods of influencing media and so forth, are going to come down as hard as they possibly can on anyone who dares to question them. So this is not only a moral obligation, this is a challenge. It's a moral obligation to stand up for Palestine, but it's also a challenge because it means you're going to be part, we are all going to be part of a struggle against racism and against violence that is perpetrated by an entity that is fighting for its life and is fighting viciously. And what they try to do is they try to conflate Zionism with Judaism. So they say if you oppose Zionism, you're anti-Semitic. Zionism and Judaism could not be more different. Zionism is a racist ideology that was developed and is executed by Jewish people, that's true. But it does not represent all Jews. Whenever you hear the Jewish community was offended because Miko Peled called it apartheid, whatever, that has got nothing to do with the Jewish community. It's the Zionist groups. It's the Zionist communities. Because there's no one Jewish community. There are hundreds of Jewish communities. Some are Zionists, some are anti-Zionist, some don't care about Zionism, some are religious, some are secular. There's no such thing as a Jewish community. But the way they present it is they come over and they say, the Jewish community was offended. The Jewish community says this. Which Jewish community? Where are they? The important thing is to realize that to oppose Israel, to reject Zionism, is a moral obligation that many Jews believe in. There are many Jews who speak like I do. There are many Jewish communities who've opposed Israel and opposed Zionism from the very beginning. This has nothing to do with Jewish people. This has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Quite the opposite. This is a fight against racism. It's a fight against racism, and again I'll say this, there are countless of Jewish communities and countless of Jewish people who support the struggle against Zionism and against the State of Israel. In fact, there's a document that was published in the year 1900. The year 1900 by the major rabbis of the Jewish world. And mind you, 1900 is, is before World War II, it's before the Holocaust. There were millions of Jews living in Europe, there were Jews in the Arab countries, and this was a document that was published in which rabbis from everywhere participated. And in this document, they speak about the dangers, and they warn about the dangers that Zionism and this idea of a Jewish state will bring about. They warn the world and they warn Jewish people not to participate in this because it is dangerous, because it will lead to violence, because it will ruin the relations between Jews and Muslims and Jews and Arabs that traditionally were good relations. The major rabbis around the world published this in the year 1900. So their opposition to Zionism, Jewish opposition to Zionism, and Jewish opposition to the idea of a Jewish state goes back for a very, very long time. So now the question remains, how do we participate? How do we participate in this? And I have to say, solidarity with Palestine is no longer good enough. Like I said earlier, Palestine is like a person bleeding to death and bleeding very fast. The blood is gushing out very fast. Standing next to this human being and encouraging them and giving them solidarity is not going to stop the bleeding. It's not going to help. What is required of all of us is to participate in the resistance. To participate in the resistance, to participate in the struggle to end the apartheid, to end the genocide, to end the ethnic cleansing, and to free Palestine. And Palestinians gave us a gift. Palestinians told us exactly what we can do. In fact, they told us what we should do if we want to participate. They gave us a roadmap. And that roadmap, that gift, is the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS. Which is why I wear this everywhere I go. The call for BDS has been demonized, turned into a devil, turned into this great anti-Semitic monster that wants to God knows what. Okay? But it's complete nonsense. The call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is absolutely the right call. It is dedicated, it is principled, it does not involve violence, and the demands of the call for BDS are the most reasonable, the most sensible, and the most remedial demands we will ever see. So what are the demands of the call for BDS? Ending the military occupation where it exists. Like I explained earlier, there are parts of Palestine where there is military rule, where Palestinians live under a military rule. Allowing the refugees to return to their homes and their land. And equal rights. In other words, justice, freedom, and equality. And somebody wants to say that that the call for justice, freedom, and equality is somehow contravenes Judaism, is somehow anti-Semitic. It's the most absurd and perhaps anti-Semitic claim I have ever heard. The call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the demands to end the military occupation, to allow the refugees to return, and for equal rights are the most reasonable and remedial demands. In other words, they're not there to create problems or to destroy or kill somebody else. They are there in order to remedy the situation in which Palestinians were placed. So Palestinians exist either in an apartheid regime, which means there's no equal rights. When I'm in Palestine, the rights and the privileges that I have are not the same rights as Palestinians, even if they do have Israeli citizenship. Then we have Palestinians living under military rule. And then we have Palestinians who are outside, who don't have the right to even return and are thrown in horrific conditions in refugee camps. The call for BDS calls to remedy these three situations. Remedying these three situations are exactly the key to bringing justice and freedom to Palestine. These three conditions are exactly the three conditions that ail Palestine and need to be remedied. And when these three conditions are remedied, when there are equal rights, when there's no military rule, when the refugees are allowed to return, then Israelis and Palestinians can live like normal people in Palestine, in a free Palestine. So in other words, the demands of BDS are actually the keys to justice and freedom and peace in Palestine. There's nothing wrong, there's nothing violent, there's nothing that contradicts peace within the call for BDS. Quite the opposite. These are the keys. BDS is the key for peace, for justice, for freedom in Palestine. So I think it's crucial that everybody find out how they can participate. How they can participate. And there's a group here that organized this event today that does excellent work here in Torino. But you can also go to the BDS website. You can see what kind of work they're doing, what kind of products to boycott, how to boycott. But it's crucial that we all participate in this call, that we all participate in the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And as we sit here, as they say, all rich, free, and alive, all at the same time. We are obliged not only to struggle, but we're also obliged, I believe, and I know I'm giving you many obligations today, but we're also obliged to find hope. We cannot look at Palestine and say, it's hopeless. No, they kill each other, they're always going to kill each other. We don't have the right to say that. We have to find hope. And once we find hope, we have to fight in order to make that hope a reality. And I believe, absolutely believe, that we can make a change, that we can create a reality in Palestine where Israelis and Palestinians do live together in peace in a free Palestine. But it cannot happen as long as I have privilege over Palestinians. And just two or three things before I finish. One is this. We see the words Free Palestine quite a lot. We see them on t-shirts, we see them on banners, we see them on stickers, we see them everywhere. What does that mean? What is Free Palestine? What does it mean? Unless we define what is Palestine, unless we define what we mean by free, we're never going to know. Now, Palestine is very well defined, like I described earlier, from the Mediterranean Sea to the River Jordan, from the Lebanese border to the Gulf of Aqaba. That's Palestine. It's very well defined. What is freedom? Freedom, it means no checkpoints, no walls, no racist laws, equality, freedom for everyone, the same rights, the same privileges for everyone, no political prisoners, no difference between people based on race or religion or ethnicity or gender and so forth. That's what freedom is. We have to make sure that we understand that a free Palestine means the entire country completely free. That's what we have to understand. Completely free from a racist regime, completely free from the apartheid regime. And I believe, and I want to invite everybody here to start calling this country Palestine. Not Israel, Palestine, Palestine, Israel, Israel, and occupied this, that, the other. No, it is Palestine. Because if we call it Israel, we are legitimizing these horrible crimes that are being committed by Israel, that have created Israel. If we call it Palestine, that is the historic name of the country. It's the name that the indigenous Palestinian people call it, and it's the right thing to do. We need to call it Palestine, we need to fight for its freedom, and we need to understand that a free Palestine does not come at the expense of somebody else. The Zionist thinking is only one side can have rights, only one side can be free, because if they have the freedom, oh my goodness, what they're going to do to us. That is a sick perspective. That is a sick point of view. The reality about which we speak right now, I'm speaking right now, of a free Palestine means that everyone is free and everyone can live in peace together. That is exactly what I believe we should be. That should be our hope. That should be our goal. That should be what we all struggle for. And we should all, every single one of us, participate. Because if we do, then we are going to see a free Palestine, and we will see it very soon. Thank you very much.